shoals of fish over a reef are one of the most beautiful sights in the world. Gliding through the clear water like flocks of birds, they are at home in an environment where man is an intruder. For all its complexity and apparent permanence, a reef is a fragile community. Sudden invisible currents of unusually cold water can kill the coral, or storms can sweep in from the sea, bringing destruction. Nowadays, anchor chains drag over the reefs, polluting chemicals flood over them, or clouds of silt drift out from the shore. Now, the sight of healthy coral growing in clear water is becoming a rarity in parts of the world's warm seas. In Florida, some winters have brought disaster. In 1969, a prolonged cold spell killed a whole near-shore reef. More recently, changes in the water quality of Florida Bay have led to mass mortality of seagrasses and sponges. These are crucial for the survival of juvenile lobsters in the protected nursery areas of the Everglades and Biscayne National Parks. Yet all is not doom and gloom on the Florida coast. The worsening situation finally inspired people to do something about it. They started by throwing rubbish into the sea, old tires, for example. Underwater, something happens to the tires. They undergo a sea change, turning from rubbish to what's known as an artificial reef. When they first settle, the tires immediately provide fish with shelter, something that they lack in areas with a flat, sandy bottom. Later, they will provide more than that. The tires were an investment for the future. This dredging operation is stirring up silt, which is bound to damage the plants and animals of the seabed, even some distance away. By the time the work is finished and the silt has settled, the neighboring coral will probably be dying or already dead. Formerly, that would have been the end of it. The local business community would lose trade as the divers and fishermen went elsewhere for sport, and the seabed would remain impoverished. Now, though, an artificial reef might be the answer. The earliest artificial reefs were made by accident. The Japanese in the early 18th century were the first to notice that fishermen caught more fish near sunken ships. Today, off the Florida coast, wrecks are a great attraction for divers, partly because of the abundant fish around them. The Japanese used to sink ships deliberately to improve their fishing, a rather expensive sacrifice to the sea gods. The first artificial reef in America was made in the early 19th century, when trees were anchored to the seabed off South Carolina. Since then, reef building has become a science. With as many as 20 million amateur fishermen in America catching nearly 1 million tons of fish a year, and an inshore fishing industry catching 3 times as much, artificial reefs have become big business as well. Wrecks don't only offer fish a temporary shelter, they provide a permanent home for many species, a place to live and breed. For a passing turtle, though, a wreck is just a shelter during a long ocean journey. Many marine animals, especially young ones, need shelter for part of their lives, and they would normally find it on a reef. The apparently clear water is alive with minute organisms, including the offspring of one valuable creature, the spiny lobster. Floating platforms hung with ropes provide a means of collecting such larvae for research purposes. The research is commercially important, but it's also intriguing. To the baby lobster, the rope might as easily be a piece of weed or a soft coral. All it needs is something to hang on to, while it's too small to defend itself or get away, but big enough to be hunted by predators. The students count the lobsters hiding among the strands to discover the numbers arriving each day. The lobsters come from the open oceans, sometimes from hundreds of kilometers away. The spiny lobster has serious problems in Florida waters. Not only is it fished very heavily by commercial fishermen and casual divers, but it is also losing its natural shelters in holes in sponges and coral. As these structures die and crumble away, they have to be replaced. This reef is built from breeze blocks to offer the lobsters plenty of good-sized holes. It has the disadvantage that a rough period in this shallow water will knock it over from time to time. But on the other hand, although such a storm might kill a coral reef, it can't destroy concrete. At first, shoals of small fish are the only tenants of a new reef, especially one which has just been disturbed. The reef offers a landmark in the sea, something which fish seem to appreciate in an often featureless place. The scientists visit the reef regularly to keep a record of the species using it. Some are more interesting than others. In one of the holes, a poisonous scorpionfish has taken cover. The new reef is still relatively barren, but studies of more mature breeze block reefs show that as they age, they attract more and more residents. The key development seems to be the growth of marine plants and animals on the concrete. After 2 years, this reef supports a rich growth of sponges and algae, some sea squirts, and even a few soft corals. Now that it has more to offer, lobsters will take up residence. As they grow up, they need a steady and substantial food supply. Spiny lobsters, which in England are called crayfish, are scavengers, as well as predators on small animals. They eat shellfish too, although they have no claws like the true lobster. The reef offers them shelter during the day when they return from their nightly foraging trips. These particular spiny lobsters are not yet part of the fishery. They have grown up in a protected area where all fishing is banned, but they will have to move further afield when they grow bigger and need more food, and before long, they are almost certain to meet their first lobster pot. Every year, outside the protected areas, virtually the entire adult lobster population of Florida's shallow waters is caught and eaten. The purpose of this study was to find out how and when the youngsters moved from the safe area into the dangers of the open fishery. The lobsters are marked individually with a plastic tag and carefully measured. A lobster's age can be worked out from the length of its shell. There is a strict size limit below which lobsters may not legally be taken. The law is widely observed, but some scientists believe the size limit is too small, allowing lobsters to be killed before they reach breeding age. Unfortunately for the lobsters, they are very easy to catch by hand. These youngsters will be replaced where they were found, in their artificial but very satisfactory shelter, as more are caught to be studied. The fishermen try to catch more lobsters by increasing the number of traps they use. All the fishermen do this, and so the number of lobsters caught per trap decreases. But in fact, the actual number of lobsters caught each year remains the same. Despite heavy fishing pressure, Florida lands 3 million kilos of spiny lobsters every year. Sufficient shelter for the lobsters is vital. Artificial shelters from concrete blocks are currently being used on a large scale to provide juvenile lobsters with the refuges they need to survive. When plants and their attendant animal life are dense enough on the concrete, the lobsters will arrive in droves. Because so few of Florida's lobsters grow up to breed, the continued existence of the species and the industry in Florida waters depends on recruitment from outside. Young lobsters are continually drifting in from the open sea, but once they arrive, they can be encouraged to stay only if there is sufficient food and shelter for them. The artificial reefs are therefore part of the incentive, providing havens for immigrant lobsters. In the protected area in Biscayne National Monument, an underwater national park, the young lobsters gather. Meanwhile, the scientists search the lobster's new home with a microscope. They have discovered that the animals and plants which colonize the concrete blocks are the same as those which settle on natural reefs, bristleworms like this among them. The new reef hasn't been there long enough yet to have attracted a great variety of colonizers. Now that the value of artificial reefs to the lobster fishery has been proved, other businesses and sportsmen too have got involved. They work on a much larger scale and sometimes with quite unexpected materials. American motorists throw away hundreds of millions of worn-out tires every year. Getting rid of them has always been a problem for motor traders. Very few old tires can be reused, and dumping or burning them costs money. They build up into mountainous heaps, along with the other once expensive but now valueless debris of a consumer society. When the idea of using artificial materials to build reefs was first explored, the materials chosen were usually as close as possible to the texture and density of coral. The use of tires was a new idea, and it caught the public imagination when the reef was first created in 1969. Using underwater obstacles to improve the fishing was nothing new. The Japanese had been doing it for generations. What was new was using rubbish instead of valuable ships or specially made structures. The problem with tires is that they float. They have to be deliberately punctured and strapped into weighted bales to make sure they sink, instead of merely becoming a drifting hazard to shipping. The problem of supply is easily solved. Tyre dealers will actually pay to get rid of worn-out tyres. The money can be spent on a machine for slashing and baling the tyres, now a relatively simple operation. The tyre reefs are very popular with fishermen. It has been shown that providing new reefs actually increases the total number of fish available to be caught by providing new breeding sites. The reefs are sited and carefully mapped after discussions with the Coast Guards. Montgomery Reef, off the Florida coast near Fort Lauderdale, already has 2 million tyres on it. The site is marked with buoys to avoid any of the pleasure boats in the area becoming added to the reef as a wreck. The idea is to build up the reef in clumps. Reef-living fish prefer the outsides of the reef to the middle, and several smaller clumps have more edges than one big pile. Within a year of the tyres settling on the seabed, the new reef will already be sheltering thousands of small fish and supporting its first plant cover. These fish aren't tempting to the sportsman. Most of them are too small to eat. However, they are just the right size to attract predatory fish, the sleek hunters which are themselves the prey of human fishermen. As the coral begins to grow and the weeds spread over the tyres, they begin to look almost natural. So too do these odd-shaped objects. They're called aerojacks, and they are widely used to stabilize beaches and dunes against the onslaught of the sea. Someone thought that they might serve another purpose, as part of a man-made reef. The aerojacks provide almost exactly the same profile as a natural reef of staghorn coral, with its pinnacles and deep caves and tunnels. Another type of experimental reef was developed by the United States Geological Survey, using concrete domes, which are rather like rounded colonies of brain coral. Each dome bears a few transplanted colonies of a selection of corals to see how they survive on the open seabed. In the base of one dome is a thermograph, which records the temperature of the water, a crucial condition for survival. Even if the temperature is right, the water might be too cloudy. Corals need sunlight as well as warmth. As these pictures show, the waters off Florida's shores are not always crystal clear. The temperature of the water is a matter for nature, but much of the silt drifting here is man-made. This work, with real corals growing in artificial settings, will help to determine the tolerance of certain corals to silt and to variations in the water temperature. Already, fish are taking stock of the new seabed scenery, and a series of photographs shows that all the corals are growing, even in conditions which had been previously thought to be unsuitable. Work of this kind establishes the best types of corals for planting out in places where human activities or natural calamities have destroyed the original reef. An interesting fact that has emerged is that reef fish are very loyal to their home reef. Once they have settled in, They seldom move more than 50 meters away. If the individual colonies in the new reefs are more widely spaced, each will develop its own mini-reef with very little interchange. Planting the coral clumps closer together produces a situation more like a natural reef. It is slow work, because most coral grows very slowly, about 1¼ centimeters a year. Not far from here, on a reef called the Hen and Chickens, 90% of the coral was killed in January 1970 by an unusually prolonged flow of cold water caused by freak weather conditions. In one day, hundreds of years' growth of coral was reduced to a rotting skeleton. No one alive today will live long enough to see the Hen and Chickens reef recover. But the work of these scientists will help by trying to maintain the conditions which the coral animals need to build their delicate and fragile homes. Natural disasters must have happened often in the past, and each time the coral slowly grew back, but then the sea was clean and clear. The storm in the Florida Keys in 1942 is still remembered as one of the worst in recent history. During the storm, the ship Benwood foundered in 10 meters of water in what is now Pennicamp National Park. It may have been a disaster for the owners, but for the fish, it was a godsend. The rails are now thickly encrusted with algae and corals, and from his headquarters in the wheelhouse, an aged 2-meter grouper commands the silent ship. The Benwood is an attraction not only for shoals of small fish and their larger predators, but for divers and fishermen as well. It was an expensive way to make an artificial reef, but no one actually planned to do it at the time. But since then, obsolete ships from the American Navy have been sunk deliberately to provide homes for marine life. Until recently, the phrase reef-building animals meant only the tiny coral polyps that build their underwater castles in warm seas. Now its meaning can also be extended to include mankind, whose benevolent intervention has shown that even rubbish can undergo a sea change into something rich and beneficial to coral and so many other forms of marine life.
More wildlife on Sunday afternoon at 5:25 with high-rise building termites in African safari.